Good evening. Welcome tonight. We have a good turnout, which is really nice. I'm Georgia Kelly, and I'm the director of Praxis Peace Institute, the organization that's putting on this event tonight, and our co-sponsor is Reader's Books, and they have David Korten's new book, The Great Turning, From Empire to Earth Community, which I'll speak a little more about in a few minutes. So I want to talk a little bit about David Korten, and as you probably all know, he wrote a book called When Corporations Rule the World that I think turned most of us on, and that book is also available here. And the new book chronicles the stories of empire that have been part of American history and American mythology for generations. And in contrast to the imperial patterns that he identifies, Korten also writes of the many examples of collaborative democratic movements that are forging pathways to a sustainable future. David Korten co-founded the Positive Futures Network, which publishes Yes Magazine, and I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have seen the magazine and should subscribe, because this magazine does talk about the good stories and the positive work that's being done that our media doesn't seem to ever cover. So they give media attention to some of the really inspiring stories. He also founded the People-Centered Development Forum, and as a support network for those seeking to challenge the dominant development paradigm. He has since served as the forum's president and principal spokesperson. Korten trained in economics, organization theory, and business strategy, and has MBA and PhD degrees from Stanford University Graduate School of Business. He has taught at Harvard, has served as a regional advisor for USAID, and his work in Asia and third world countries opened his eyes, and of course that's what he's been writing about, to the consequences of economic globalization and the expansion of corporate power at the expense of democracy, equity, and environmental health. His publications are required reading in university courses around the world. The book that I just mentioned, it really is The Politics of Empire, the history and legacy of empire, awakening the consciousness and changing the story, and therefore changing the society. It focuses on civil society, collective wisdom, the role of the feminine. It is comprehensive. So please help me welcome David Korten.
Thank you very much. It is quite a delight to be here in the heart of Ecotopia. I'm sure that you all realize that in the rest of the world, we all look to you as the leading edge of the Great Turning. And my thanks to Georgia Kelly and the Peace Praxis Institute for organizing this event. And I also understand that many of you have been involved in the planning and as well in engaging in discussion groups around the book and the issues. So there's been a lot of preparation for this, and I greatly appreciate that. We're here tonight because we share a deep concern for the future of our nation and the human species. I trust that many of you also share my belief that this is an extraordinary moment of creative opportunity, born of a profound moment of awakening to the reality that we humans, in living out the reckless exuberance of our adolescence, have gotten ourselves into some serious trouble. It's time to take the step to species maturity. Now, motivated by the same sense of crisis and opportunity that brings us together here tonight, gatherings similar to our own are taking place throughout the United States and the world. Herein lies our source of hope, as this is the demonstration of the awakening. Now, the motivating force of any particular gathering may be global climate change, racism, peace, democracy, spiritual renewal, peak oil, economic justice, or any number of similar topics. Each, however, deals with the need for deep changes in our relationship to one another and Earth. I call these conversations Earth Community Dialogues because they converge on the same imperative, creating communities of place that recognize the interdependence of life. Now, I often find it useful to start my presentation by reviewing a bit of my personal story, that informs the thoughts I'll be sharing with you. But before I do that, I want to ask a question. How many of us here are over 60 years old? Very well represented. Good. Bear in mind, we are the elders in a time that deeply needs elders. Our generation has lived through an extraordinary shrinking of geographical space and expansion of intercultural exchange and communication. And that is key to the change that's taking place. My life illustrates both the shrinking geography and the expansion of communications in a rather dramatic way. I grew up in a small town in Washington State called Longview, a very conservative place. My family owned a music and appliance store. In my community, I rarely saw a person of color, never met a Muslim, Hindu, or a Buddhist. And at that point in my life, never in my wildest imagination, imagined that as an adult I would reside for 21 years outside the United States, in East Africa, Central America, and Southeast Asia, on a mission to end global poverty by sharing the secrets of U.S. business success. And in the course of this work, I would personally encounter humanity's wondrous diversity. During the course of my experience abroad, I came to realize that far from creating the universal prosperity, the economic models that drove the organizations for which I worked were actually producing devastating consequences for people and planet. And the reason in hindsight is quite clear, and the implications apply equally to us as well as to the nations in which I worked. These models called for decision-making based on maximizing returns to money, rather than on maximizing the well-being of people and planet. Now, the more deeply I examined the issues, the clearer it became that these models primarily serve the interests of global corporations and financial markets. Anything else was pretty much incidental. In 1992, Fran and I moved from the Philippines to New York City in order to focus our attention on the deeper roots of the problems we had gone abroad to resolve. And in Manhattan, located on Union Square between Wall Street and Madison Avenue, I set about to write When Corporations Rule the World. Needless to say, it was quite an inspiring setting. Then terrorists attacked the United States on September 11, 2001, and the U.S. government announced its intention to use the full force of U.S. military power to impose order on the world and secure U.S. interests. This pulled away the veil to reveal even more disturbing truths about the state of humankind, democracy, and the reality behind the idealized vision of U.S. democracy and global benevolence. My search for a deeper understanding of these issues and their implications led to the writing of The Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community. Writing this book drew me into a deep examination of the sweep of the human experience and our unfolding awareness of our human nature and our place in creation. I want to share with you a few of the conclusions of this book. Of course, the book itself addresses all of these in far greater detail. The book begins with these prophetic words from the preamble to the Earth Charter. We stand at a critical moment in Earth's history, a time when humanity must choose its future. This is truly an extraordinary moment because we have arrived at the time when we see a convergence of both the imperative and the possibility of choosing our future with conscious collective intent. Now, for 5,000 years, the dominant human societies have organized relationships at all levels, from those among nations to those among family members, by dominator hierarchy. I assume that many of you here are familiar with Riane Eisler's thesis from The Chalice and the Blade, which directly inspire my thinking on this issue. So call this time of organization by dominator hierarchy the era of empire. That era has reached the limits of exploitation that people and planet will tolerate. If we continue with business as usual, future generations are likely to look back and refer to our time as the Great Unraveling, a time of environmental and social collapse. Fortunately, it is within our means to move beyond empire and to give birth to a new era of Earth community based on a more mature understanding of our responsibilities to one another and to the Earth. Buddhist spiritual teacher, another of our neighbors here in Northern California, Joanna Macy, suggests that if we are successful in negotiating this transition, future generations may instead speak of this as the time of the Great Turning, the time when humanity turned from the way of domination and embraced the way of partnership. So this is the choice before us, the way of empire and the Great Unraveling, or the way of Earth community and the Great Turning. Our problem actually began with an earlier turning. For hundreds of thousands of years before the onset of empire, humans evolved within a cultural and institutional framework of Earth community, represented here by the Stonehenge circle of life. These early humans organized not to dominate life, but to celebrate it. Then, some 5,000 years ago, our ancestors made a tragic turn away from partnership and to the way of domination, symbolized here by the Egyptian pyramids of power. I think it's quite extraordinary that how these differences in orientation are reflected in that architecture. There's substantial evidence that the earliest human societies worshiped the goddess, balanced feminine and masculine energies, placed women in significant leadership roles, and were generally peaceful and egalitarian. However, as population density grew, humans faced the challenge of organizing social relationships beyond an immediate circle of one's own kin, and the first great turning began. The masculine drove out the feminine as men took over to rule by bow and sword in a brutal competition for power that created a relentless play or die, rule or be ruled dynamic of violence and oppression. Conquest became a measure of greatness. Female gods were replaced with male gods. The wisdom of the elders and the priestess gave way to the arbitrary rule of powerful kings. We humans lost our sense of attachment to Earth. Our societies became divided between the rulers and the ruled. It began some 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, the land we now call Iraq. Empire has since come full circle, as this is the land in which the most powerful and hopefully the last of the great empires appears destined to exhaust itself. As I did my research for the Great Turning, I was stunned to realize that every empire in history has been built on a foundation of slavery and bonded labor. You think about it, it's axiomatic. If we're going to have societies with a few people on the top, the many must be on the bottom. And it remains so in our time, with sweatshop and migrant agricultural workers being our modern equivalents. Now, since that fateful turn away from Earth community, imperial institutions have systematically reduced the vast majority of humans to conditions of servitude that suppress their creative potential, while simultaneously elevating to the highest positions of power the most power-driven and most ethically challenged among us. To this end, these institutions of empire have diverted a major portion of the resources available to human societies away from meeting the needs of people and nature in order to support the military forces, prisons, palaces, temples, retainers, and propagandists required to maintain a system that concentrates wealth and power in the hands of an elite class and secures the members of that class against the justified wrath of those consigned to conditions of literal or virtual slavery at the bottom. Throughout history, ruling elites have limited the competition for power for positions at the top of the pinnacle by denying the humanity of whole groups of persons based on race and gender, arbitrarily assigning them permanently to the bottom. Racism, sexism, classism, and environmental devastation are all manifestations of the dynamics of the play-or-die competition for imperial power. Now, over the 5,000 years of empire, the primary institutional form of empire has morphed from the imperial city-states of ancient time to the imperial nation-states of the modern era, and more recently to the imperial global corporations of our own time. The pattern of domination and exclusion, however, remains largely unchanged. Now, many people ask me, why are you so obsessed about corporations? After all, they're just communities of people. Of course, I suspect you recognize this argument misses a critical point. In a publicly traded corporation, the people, including the CEO, are all employees of the institution with few, if any, individual rights. They're paid to serve the institution at its pleasure, required by law to leave their personal values at the door, and are subject to dismissal without recourse at a moment's notice. So we have here an institution of enormous power governed by absentee owners and unaccountable managers in the business of converting the life energy of people and nature into money for the short-term financial gain of already wealthy shareholders and managers without regard to human or natural consequences. In other words, the publicly traded limited liability corporation is a gigantic pool of money with an artificial legal personality required by law to behave like a sociopath. Our modern equivalent of the unaccountable and often sociopathic kings of years gone by. Exclusion, deprivation, environmental devastation are all inevitable consequences of the cultures and institutions of empire and will remain with us so long as we allow these cultures and institutions to define our values and relationships. Now I want to look at a slightly different aspect of our current reality. Modern societies have for the past 50 years defined progress in terms of growth in the market value of economic output and consumption, in other words, economic growth. And overall, we've been highly successful at growing our economies. Since 1950, the global market value of human consumption has increased by 7 times. This growth has made a great deal of money for a few people. There is, however, another less fortunate side to the story. This is the Living Planet Index, a measure of the health of the world's freshwater, ocean, and forest ecosystems, the life support system of the planet. This index has declined by 37% in the past 30 years. Now, there is good news, of course, at least from this perspective of the planet, and that is that the species that bears the responsibility for this devastation will be gone well before the index reaches 0. Yeah, think about that. Now, about 85% of what remains of our planet's shrinking natural wealth is expropriated by the more fortunate 20% of the world's population to support often wasteful patterns of consumption. Meanwhile, the least fortunate 20% of humans struggle to survive on slightly more than 1%. Environmental devastation and the gap between rich and poor are growing at an accelerating rate as the owners of capital monopolize ever more of the productive capacity of the planet, and workers are squeezed to provide their labor at ever lower prices. This leads to an inexorable conclusion. On a finite planet, sustainability and equity are inseparably linked. Now, radical and potentially devastating change is currently guaranteed by the mounting forces of a perfect economic storm born of a convergence of peak oil, climate change, and a US dollar meltdown. It becomes more certain by the day that this convergence is poised to bring a rapid and potentially devastating unraveling of the corporate global economy. As I'm sure many of you here are know, peak oil occurs when global oil production peaks and begins its inexorable decline in the face of continued rising demand, sending prices soaring. Oil output may have peaked last year in 2005. It may not peak for another 35 years, but that difference is basically irrelevant because we must act immediately to eliminate our dependence on oil. The era of cheap oil is over. And here are some of the implications of how our way of life will change. Oil-dependent transportation and global supply chains, finished. Auto-dependent suburbia, strip malls, and box stores like Walmart located in the middle of nowhere, finished. Oil-dependent industrial agriculture, finished. Now, do you see any oil dependence here? These, of course, are the military forces on which we depend to secure our access to cheap oil. They, too, are relics of a dying era. As oil prices inexorably rise, much of our existing capital stock will be reduced to stranded assets, including much of the supporting capital of our sprawling and unsustainable suburbs. Might this be the future of Walmart? Automobiles are another example. Options for converting them to other power sources may be limited, although this is a prototype currently under testing. The consequences of peak oil will be exacerbated by climate change. During the 20th century, average surface temperature of the planet increased by 0.6 degrees Celsius. Projections of the increase anticipated by the end of the current century range from 2 degrees to 4.5 degrees Celsius. We are already experiencing an ominous trend in weather-related natural disasters stemming from this temperature increase. From the decade of the 1950s to the first 5 years of the 21st century, that is within the lifetimes of most of us in this room, the annual average of severe weather events increased from 24 per year to 350 per year. Hurricanes Katrina and Rita are but a foretaste of what lies ahead. According to a study commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense, we can expect shorter growing seasons and a 10 to 25% global loss of crop yield. Water shortages, increase in forest fires, famine, disease, and severe weather events, endemic resource wars, and uncontrolled migration. We're dealing with serious business. The third element of the perfect economic storm, the meltdown of the U.S. dollar, is the consequence of a growing U.S. trade deficit that hit $750 billion in 2005 and is continuing to grow at an accelerating pace. Growth in the trade gap is a measure of the extent to which we in the United States are living ever further beyond our own means, running up a credit card debt to the rest of the world, and leaving the bill to our children. It is also a measure of the rate at which we are hemorrhaging both the family wage jobs that created the U.S. middle class and the manufacturing, technology, and research capabilities that go with those jobs. On the day the rest of the world tires of selling on credit to an economic deadbeat, the financial house of cards that supports our profligate ways will collapse. Now, there's three potential scenarios for our future. If we choose to play out a last man standing competition for the remaining resources of the planet, we can anticipate some combination of escalating military conflict and possible nuclear Armageddon, and/or a feudal fragmentation of society similar to what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire. Fortunately, of course, there is an alternative, and that is to join in common cause in a cooperative effort to bring forth a living partnership of Earth community. The combination of peak oil, severe weather events, and a U.S. dollar meltdown will force a dramatic restructuring of the way we live as economic incentives shift from global to local supply chains and from suburban sprawl to compact communities. The communities that will fare best are likely to be those that act now to rebuild local supply chains with particular emphasis on becoming substantially self-reliant in energy and food. The imperative thus becomes an opportunity to rebuild functioning communities, restore a sense of place, democratize economic power, and radically revise our priorities for the use of labor, land, and other natural resources to give priority to life values over financial values. It's divinely fortunate that we humans have achieved the means to assume collective responsibility for our future at the precise moment we have encountered the imperative to do so. I take this as evidence that creation is intelligent, compassionate, and wants the human species to succeed. Consider, it's only been a little more than 60 years ago that we created the United Nations, which for all its imperfections made it possible for the first time in the human experience for representatives of all the world's nations to meet in a neutral space to resolve differences through dialogue rather than through force of arms. Less than 50 years ago, we ventured into space to look back and see ourselves as one people, sharing a common destiny on a living spaceship. This fundamentally changed our perception of ourselves and our relationship to the planet. It has only been within the last 10 to 15 years that we have acquired the communications technologies that give us the ability for the first time, should we choose to use it, to link every human on the planet into a seamless web of nearly costless communication and cooperation. These are the capabilities that make it possible to choose our future as a conscious intention. So 4 million years have passed from the time human-like species first inhabited the Earth and the first use of the atomic bomb. We acquired the organizational capacity and technological capacity to choose the human future with collective intent within the span of the lifetimes of most of us here. Our future will be determined by how we choose as a species to use these new capabilities. Now, unfortunately, our ability to make the obvious choice for life is seriously hampered by ill-advised economic policies crafted by corporate lobbyists who give priority to corporate profits at the expense of the well-being of our children, families, communities, democracy, and nature. What I'm going to lay out right now provides the foundation for a political agenda and a political case that could totally win back our country from the far right. Simply noting that the favored policies being put forward by the far right drive down the wages and benefits for working people, thus forcing parents to take on multiple jobs paying less than a family wage that leave no time for child care or community participation. The rollback regulations that protect the health and safety of children, families, communities, and the environment so corporations can discharge tons of toxins into our air and water to save themselves a little money. They place quality education, health care, housing, and retirement beyond the reach of most Americans. They give free rein to corporate lobbyists to buy political favors in defiance of the values and well-being of average Americans. They give corporations billions of dollars in tax deductions for the cost of direct marketing to children, to bond our children to lifetime brand identities, entice them into lifetime addictions to junk food and alcohol and cigarettes, and to sell violent video games. So how do the self-serving champions of corporate greed achieve our willing participation in destroying so many of the things we most value? The answer, I suggest, lies in the power of the stories by which we humans share our understanding of ourselves and our world. Through control of media and education, the institutions of empire drown out the voices of the authentic storytellers to create a kind of cultural trance that blinds us to our higher human possibilities. Consider, for example, our national story. One of the things I found most unsettling as I did my research for the Great Turning was the realization that the belief I had held throughout my life that the United States was founded as a democracy, with institutions that embody the highest expression of the democratic ideal, is based on lies. Ending hereditary monarchy and introducing the separation of church and state to end theocracy were important advances made by the Founding Fathers. Beyond that, however, much of the story of our national founding is a self-limiting myth that forestalls critical inquiry into possibilities yet unrealized to achieve the true democratic ideal. Consider these well-known facts. Our Constitution was written by white male landowners, and if you look closely at it, you will see that it was written to enshrine their power. The land we occupy was taken by force and deceit from Native Americans. Much of that land was worked by slaves. Women didn't get the vote until 1920. Even with the progress achieved through 2 centuries of popular struggle, daily events demonstrate to anyone who's paying attention that our nation still falls far short of realizing the democratic ideal. In the words of Francis Moore Lappé, to save the democracy we thought we had, we must take it to where it has never been. The misdirection does not end with the mythic version of our national story. Our national disability is compounded by our cultural conditioning to believe that it is our human nature to be individualistic and often violent competitors for power, money, and material possessions. By this reckoning, living by the principles of Earth community would be contrary to our nature and thus is a hopelessly naive idea. This, of course, is perhaps the most basic of empire's many destructive lies. Psychologists who study the developmental pathway of the human consciousness report that those of us who enjoy the requisite emotional support from our families, our communities, our friends and associates, traverse throughout our lifetimes a pathway from the undifferentiated and self-referential consciousness of the newborn to the highly differentiated and inclusive consciousness of the wise elder. In short, we are a species of many potential natures. Now, this misdirection of our cultural stories plays out as well in the cultural stories by which we define the pathway to prosperity, security, and meaning. Consider how each of the following familiar stories reaffirm empire's relationships of domination. The imperial prosperity story says that an eternally growing economy brings prosperity for all. Economic growth requires wealthy investors who create jobs. Thus, for the good of society, we must free wealthy people from the taxes and regulations that limit their ability to accumulate the fortunes that allow them to invest. We must also eliminate welfare programs that strip away the incentives for poor people to be productive members of society by accepting jobs at whatever wages the market offers. Then there's the imperial security story that tells of a dangerous world filled with criminals, terrorists, and foreign enemies who must be controlled or removed by strong police and military forces. Then we come to an imperial meaning story that tells of a God who commands us to go forth to establish dominion over the earth, rewards the righteous with wealth and power, and mandates that they rule over the poor who justly suffer divine punishment for their sins. Meaning is found in obedience to God and his appointed representatives. Now note the recurring pattern. These imperial stories affirm the legitimacy of economic inequality, the use of physical force to impose the will of rulers, and the special righteousness of the rich and powerful. Have you ever heard any of these stories before? Now, part of the challenge before us is to learn to recognize those stories every time we hear them for what they are. Propaganda intended to keep us enslaved to the institutions and dominator structures of empire. Although it may seem absurdly simple, the key to changing the course of the human future is to change the stories by which we live. It begins with finding the courage to break the silence and speak openly the truth in our hearts. By speaking our truth, we can find one another and end our isolation by forming communities of congruence that link and grow. And together we can change the prevailing cultural stories, honor the needs of our children, facilitate the liberation of the higher orders of human consciousness, and change the course of the human future. So what is the unifying narrative of these new stories? It isn't really all that complicated once you put your mind to thinking about it. Our human nature is defined by our capacity and our responsibility to choose our nature. That's the nature of being human, the power to choose. Democracy is a work in progress. True prosperity, security, and meaning are found in vibrant, caring, interlinked communities that support every person in realizing the fullness of their humanity. Consider this extraordinarily radical idea. Forget about growing the economy. Concentrate on growing strong and healthy children, families, communities, and natural systems, and prosperity, security, and meaning will surely follow. Nothing terribly esoteric here. It's not rocket science, as they say. I'm sure many of you have heard the story of the metamorphosis of the caterpillar to the butterfly told by our friend and neighbor evolution biologist Elizabeth Sahtouris, which of course provides a powerful metaphor for the human metamorphosis from empire to earth community. The caterpillar is a voracious consumer that devotes its life to gorging on nature's bounty. When it has had its fill, it fastens itself to a convenient twig and wraps itself in a chrysalis to take a rest. Once snug inside, crisis strikes. As the structures of its cellular tissue begin to dissolve into an organic soup. This, of course, represents disaster from the perspective of the caterpillar's lower worm nature, but it represents opportunity for its higher butterfly nature. Now, guided by some deep inner wisdom, a number of what scientists call organizer cells begin to rush around gathering other cells into imaginal buds, which are multicellular structures that begin to take on the shape of crucial organs of the new creature. And if you look closely here, you can begin to see the outlines of a monarch butterfly through the increasingly transparent chrysalis. Now, correctly perceiving a threat to the old order, what remains of the caterpillar's still intact immune system attributes the threat to the imaginal buds and attacks them as alien intruders. See any parallels to our situation? Now, the cells that engage the work of creating the butterfly ultimately prevail by linking up with one another in a cooperative emergent process that gives birth to a new creature of extraordinary beauty that lives lightly on the earth, serves the regeneration of life by pollinating flowers, has the capacity to traverse vast expanses of the North American continent to experience life's possibilities in ways the earthbound caterpillar could scarcely have imagined. Now, we humans stand on the threshold of a rebirth no less dramatic as our familiar institutional structures disintegrate around us. The transformation of the caterpillar is physical. Ours is cultural and spiritual. Whereas the caterpillar faces an outcome preordained by the experience of countless generations before and embedded in the genetic structure of its cells, we are path-breaking pioneers in uncharted territory. Our work is to advance turnings from dominator to partnership in each of the three major spheres of human activity: the cultural, economic, and political. Now, the work of the cultural turning centers on liberating ourselves from our cultural conditioning to the values of empire and awakening the potentials of the higher orders of human cultural and spiritual consciousness. This awakening brings a turning from financial values to life values, from spiritual division to spiritual unity, and from fearing our differences to rejoicing in our diversity, from the scarcity of the competition for dominator power to the abundance of cooperation for partnership power. The transformation of cultural values establishes the foundations for an economic turning, from evaluating progress by financial indicators to evaluating progress by the health of our children, families, and communities, from hoarding to sharing, from absentee ownership by the few to local stakeholder ownership by the many, from land use policies that favor suburban sprawl to land use policies that favor compact communities that bring home, work, and recreation within easy reach by foot, bicycle, and public transit, from conversion of farm and forest land to the restoration of farm and forest land, and from energy-intensive corporate factory farms to local low-input family farms producing flavorful, toxin-free foods. Now, this transformation of economic relationships creates the necessary foundation for a political turning from a $1 one-vote democracy to a one-person one-vote democracy, from passive citizenship to active citizenship, from competition for individual advantage to cooperation for mutual advantage, from retributive justice to restorative justice, and from social order by physical coercion to social order by mutual responsibility and accountability. The most visible manifestation of the Great Turning to Earth community is a newly emergent social organism that transcends the barriers of race, class, religion, and nationality to act as a shared conscience of the species. The development of this organism is without precedent in the human experience. We've come to know it by the name Global Civil Society. The World Social Forum is its annual meeting place. On February 15, 2003, Global Civil Society mobilized more than 10 million people around the globe on the same day to oppose the planned U.S. invasion of Iraq. This extraordinary expression of a shared vision of a world of peace and justice for all was self-organized with no central organization, no central operating budget, no charismatic leader. It was done by millions of ordinary people, each exercising a leadership role and using the internet as their connecting web. At Yes Magazine, we call it a conspiracy of hope. Okay, all this said, what of our politically divided nation? What are our possibilities for unity? I believe there's a far greater readiness in these United States to join in the Great Turning from empire to earth community than we might first assume. For all the talk of red states and blue states, polling data reveal a startling degree of consensus on key issues, suggesting that we are in fact mostly purple states. Now, would you believe there's any major question on which 90% of Americans agree? Yeah, pretty major. A recent poll reported that 90% of us agree that big companies have too much power. Well, that's not too bad a starting point. 83% of us believe that as a society, the United States is focused on the wrong priorities. Are we all on board so far? Supermajorities of more than 80% want to give higher priority to children, family, community, and a healthy environment. So what are we seeing? Americans want a world that puts people ahead of profits, spiritual values ahead of financial values, and international cooperation ahead of international domination. Now, I want you to note specifically here that none of these are distinctively conservative, or distinctively liberal values. They are widely shared human values. Beneath it all, we are one nation yearning for healthy children, families, communities, and natural environments. So let me see the hands. How many of us are part of this national consensus here? Okay. We are not representatives of an alternative fringe minority. We are the cutting edge of a national supermajority, and it is appropriate for us to begin acting accordingly. Contemporary scientific findings point to a profound yet elegantly simple insight that appropriately frames the new stories it is ours to tell. Relationships are the foundation of everything. Now, whereas Newtonian physics was based on a premise that only the material is real, the new quantum physics suggests that the material is an illusion. Only relationships are real. The new biology teaches that by the nature of how life manages energy, life can only exist in relationship to other life. Psychologists tell us that healthy relationships are the key to achieving a mature human consciousness. Life exists only in community. True prosperity, security, and meaning are found in the life of vibrant, interlinked communities that encourage and support every person in realizing their full creative potential. This is a defining moment. We face an unprecedented choice. Give up the reckless ways of our species' adolescence and adopt and accept responsibility for one another and the planet, or continue on a path to collective suicide. In its profound wisdom, the spiritual force of creation is calling us to take the step to a new level of species maturity. It requires a sweeping cultural and institutional transformation. Now let us be clear, the work of the Great Turning is not to fix empire with adjustments at the margin. Rather, it is to birth a new era grounded in a choice for life that restores to people, families, and communities the power that the institutions of empire have usurped. We cannot wait for or expect that the leadership in this great work will come from within the institutions of empire, which of course are the equivalent of the caterpillar's immune system. These institutions are corrupted to the core and their time is passing. The leadership must come from people like us, the organizer cells of a new era, working through our local governments, businesses, churches, educational institutions, and nonprofits to build vital democratic communities. This is why the work that you are doing here in this community is so important. Wherever we live, we must each commit ourselves to the work of making our particular community a place of an inspiring model for the nation and for the world. Together we will learn, share, create, and ultimately turn the human course. So in summary, break the silence, end the isolation, change the story. Support an Earth community dialogue to facilitate the birthing of Earth community in the place where you live. Embrace the challenge of making your community an inspiring model for what can be. Use the Great Turning from Empire to Earth community as a resource for personal study and for engaging your friends and colleagues in discussing the great work of our time. Check out our website at www.greatturning.org for group discussion guides and for information on engaging your community in an Earth community dialogue. Discover Yes Magazine as a source for inspiring stories, ideas, and resources for action. The issue that was passed out just came out this week. It's a companion issue to the book, The Great Turning. It poses the question, 5,000 years of empire, ready for a change? Our destructive human capacity for reflection and intentional choice carries a corresponding moral responsibility to care for one another and the planet. We must now test the limits of the individual and collective creative potential of our species as we strive to become the change we seek. In these turbulent and frightening times, it is important to remind ourselves that we are privileged to live at the most exciting moment of creative opportunity in the whole of the human experience. The future is in our hands. Now is the hour. We have the power. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Thank you.